Hello, and welcome to our podcast on the U.S. Senate. In this podcast, you'll notice many similarities with our earlier podcast on the U.S. House of Representatives, including general appearance, visuals, and organization. Again, we'll be taking a look at what the U.S. Senate is exactly, what are its powers, where it's located, and some specific details and requirements of its members. So let's go ahead and get started. First, let's answer the question, what is the Senate? For our purposes, and for your understanding, we'll be considering the Senate at the federal or national level of government. You've already been introduced and begun applying the constitutional principle of federalism. Here is yet another example of that constitutional principle. Since the Senate exists at the federal level, they make up the second part of what is known as the legislative branch. Their primary function, then, is to work with the House of Representatives to create laws. As one of two houses of Congress, these laws are, again, drafted, debated, amended, and eventually voted on. If successful, such bills would pass to the other House of Congress, the House of Representatives, where once again, the bill would be debated, amended, and eventually voted on before going to the President's desk for final approval. Like the House, the Senate derives its power from Article 1, Section 8 of the United States Constitution. Let's take another look at what those powers are specifically. By both creating and passing specific legislation, the Senate can raise and collect taxes, borrow money, regulate commerce or trade, coin or make money, establish courts, which are inferior or lower than the Supreme Court, declare war, and they are also privy to something called the Elastic Clause, which we already introduced to you in the House of Representatives podcast. The Senate, then, also has the constitutional authority to create laws that are necessary and proper for carrying out the previously mentioned powers. When looking at the actual U.S. Capitol building, the Senate conducts its business in the smaller side, the Senate chamber here on the right. Generally, most people have not seen the Senate's chamber, as it tends to be smaller and holds less people when compared to the House's chamber on the opposite side of the Capitol. Let's now talk about some specific details of the Senate. First, there are 100 total members in the Senate. This is a fixed or set number, with each state receiving 2 senators. Unlike the House, the Senate's representation does not vary based upon a state's population. So a state like Wyoming, which includes a little over 500,000 people, they receive the same amount of representation in the Senate as, say, a state with a much larger population, someplace like California, Florida, and Texas. No matter what a state and Senate member represents, all Senate members are elected to serve a 6-year term. Like the House, the Constitution does not place a limit on the number of terms Senate members may serve. In other words, so long as the Senate member continues to meet a number of specific requirements, they may serve in the Senate for a very long time. Interestingly, though, only 1/3 of senators are up for re-election at any one time, or every 2 years. This differs from the House, as their re-election bids occur every 2 years. That said, the Senate experiences much less change within its ranks than the House. Now let's take a look at what those requirements are. First, Senate members must be at least 30 years of age to hold office. They must also be a natural-born or naturalized citizen of the United States for the past 9 years. They, too, must live in the state they represent at the time of the election. Lastly, they are assigned and must serve on at least 2 or more committees, which we'll break down a little bit later on in the podcast. Some notable characteristics of Senate members are that they represent larger constituencies than House members. That being said, then, there is more prestige or popularity with Senate members than the House. For example, typically senators receive much more media coverage than their House peers, even if their party is not in the majority. Finally, because there are significantly fewer senators than the House, Senate rules allow for unlimited debate within the Senate. The Senate, then, does allow for the filibuster. The filibuster is simply a way to delay a vote on a bill. Such politics would be employed, again, as a way to check and balance the power of the majority party. The most notable filibuster was by Senator Strom Thurmond of South Carolina in 1957. He spoke for 24 hours and 18 minutes against the Civil Rights Act of 1957. During his filibuster, he recited the Declaration of Independence, Bill of Rights, President George Washington's farewell address, and many other historical documents along the way. Thurmond was not the only lawmaker to filibuster on the issue, however. According to Senate records, teams of senators consumed 57 days filibustering between March 26 and June 19th, the day the Civil Rights Act of 1957 passed. Regarding the organization of the Senate, again, the United States Constitution, in Article 1, authorizes both the House of Representatives and the Senate. At the top of this chart, you'll see that the Vice President sits atop the Senate. Below the Vice President, in both power and notoriety, is then the President pro tempore, Majority Party Leader and Majority Party Whip, Minority Party Leader and Minority Party Whip, and finally committee chairs. We won't discuss all of their respective roles much right now, as we simply want to provide you with the vocabulary and a visual support for that organizational design of the Senate. So take a second, pause your podcast, jot down this information, and we'll come back. These specific positions and committee chairs do not see much change, as the structure of the Senate, unlike the House, changes more slowly, as earlier I told you that senators run less often for re-election, that is, every 6 years. The Vice President then represents the political party that sits in the White House, and may even have more members and thus form the majority party, like we see at the time when we're making this podcast in 2018. The Vice President, among other things, serves as the President of the Senate, and generally serves as a non-voting member unless their vote is needed to break a tie. The President pro tempore, or President for a time, is elected by the Senate and is, by custom, the senator of the majority party with the longest record of continuous service. They tend to preside over the chamber in the absence of the Vice President and is largely viewed as a ceremonial position. In terms of the balance of power in the Senate, here is but one basic way to visualize it. You'll probably first notice which specific session of the Senate this set of data pertains to, the 2017 through 2019 Senate. You'll probably also observe which specific political party held the majority of seats in the Senate, that is, the Republicans. The primary powers of the Senate, then, are to create or start legislation or bills. As a reminder, the Senate is not initially in charge of any bill requiring money. For instance, any bill having to do with our highways, or funding the military, etc., that is created and ultimately passed out of the House first. However, the Senate is the only part of Congress that has the authority to sign a treaty, even though the President may begin such negotiations. Additionally, the Senate has the constitutional authority to approve any of the executive branch's appointments, including Supreme Court nominations as well as lower court judicial appointees. And lastly, in the event a president violates the Constitution and/or the office of the presidency, the Senate has the ability to carry out the trial following what is known as articles of impeachment, or removal of the President of the United States. In order for a president to officially be removed, a majority of senators, that is 51, must vote and agree to convict the president. As discussed in the earlier House of Representatives podcast, President Andrew Johnson in 1868 was charged with violating the 10-Year of Office Act, as well as more recently, President Bill Clinton in 1998 was charged for perjury as well as obstruction of justice. In the end, neither President Johnson nor President Clinton were ever convicted or impeached and ultimately remained in office, but such charges did negatively impact their legacies as President of the United States. Well, that concludes our podcast on the Senate. As always, if you have any questions or wonderings, please be sure to bring those back to class and we'll find some time to discuss them. Thanks so much.